When you hear the word church, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For most of us, right? It's a building. You probably picture a steeple, some pews, maybe a stage. But what if that image, the one that's so deeply ingrained in all of our minds, is completely different from what the very first Christians were thinking about? Today, we're going to dig into a concept that a lot of us just take for granted, the whole idea of church.
Okay, so let's just dive right into this. The difference between how we see church today and the original ecclesia is, well, it's pretty shocking. On one hand, you've got our modern idea, a special building, a formal service run by a professional, and a congregation that, let's be honest, often feels more like an audience. But the original, it was just an assembly of people, an informal, totally participatory gathering that looked way more like a family getting together than a crowd of spectators. The difference is absolutely staggering, and it changes almost everything.
So how did we get from an active, participating family to, a passive audience watching a performance? The whole journey really starts with the words themselves and how their meanings have drifted so far over time.
And here it is. This is the definition we all know, right? When we say, let's go to church, we mean a place, a sacred space, kind of separate from the everyday world, and it's designed for one specific thing, worship. This idea is so fundamental to us that we almost never even think to question it.
But, and this is a huge but, the original word used in the New Testament is ecclesia. It was a super common, everyday Greek word that just meant an assembly or a gathering of people. It had absolutely nothing to do with a building. In fact, it's never, not once, used in the Bible to talk about a physical structure. Translating ecclesia, which means the people, as church, which we think of as a building, is what some scholars call a massive historical blunder, an anachronism.
Theologian D.A. Carson just nails the problem with this quote. He's talking about a kind of presentism. We take our modern experience, our fancy buildings, our formal services, our professional clergy, and we basically project it all backwards onto the ancient text. We just assume their ecclesia must have looked something like our church, and when we do that, we might be missing the entire point.
This brings us to a second and honestly, maybe even more surprising discovery. Once you set aside all our modern ideas, you find that the word worship, at least how we use it for a Sunday service, is almost completely gone when the Bible talks about Christians getting together.
So the main Greek words for religious devotion are proskuneo, which means to bow down, latreo, which is more about a priestly service in a temple, and sebomai, to revere. Now, in the New Testament, these words are always used to describe a person's entire life of service and devotion to God. But what they don't describe is the list of activities that happen when Christians actually met. The gathering itself was not called a worship service. And that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? If the whole point of their meetings wasn't to perform some kind of religious service for God, like a temple ritual, then what on earth were they doing? What was the reason for even getting together?
Well, the Apostle Paul gives us a direct answer. The one guiding principle, the whole purpose of the gathering, was oikodome. It's a Greek word, and it literally means to build up or edification. So the whole meeting was aimed at a horizontal goal, for the people to mutually build each other up in their faith. It was all about one anothering, which is a completely different focus from a vertical worship service directed at God.
So if the goal is mutual edification, building each other up, what does that actually look like? Well, it completely changes the dynamic of the meeting. It stops being a performance by just a few people for everyone else. Instead, every single person has a critical role to play.
This verse right here is absolutely revolutionary. Paul's assumption is, when you come together, each of you has something to contribute. It wasn't about showing up empty-handed to just receive something from a designated professional or a mediator. No, the expectation was that every believer led by the Spirit would show up ready to give something to build up the whole spiritual family.
And what did that look like? It was dynamic, it was open, it was totally interactive. People would share songs and teachings and new insights and scriptures and words of encouragement. It was a time where every single member of the body of Christ was expected to function, to contribute their unique gift. It was an all-play, definitely not a spectator sport.
The difference is just it's night and day. The early assembly was this spontaneous, interactive dialogue. Today's service is so often a pre-planned, linear monologue delivered to a passive audience. One scholar, Ralph Martin, called it a haunting question why our modern practice is so completely at odds with this clear instruction. And it seems like this huge shift from every member participation to spectator passivity is a direct result of losing that original vision of ecclesia.
In this building up focus, it doesn't just change the main event. It radically changes how we see the key rituals and even the roles people play inside the gathering. It was never about performing a ceremony. It was about living like a family.
Just think about the Lord's Supper. Today, it's often this really quiet, solemn moment with a tiny wafer and a little sip of juice. But originally, it was a full-on communal meal, a real supper, probably a potluck in someone's home. It was so real that it had real-world problems. Paul actually had to call out the Corinthian believers because some were eating and drinking too much while the poor people were going hungry. It was a messy, communal family meal, not a tidy, formal ritual.
And when we talk about speaking, there's this vital difference we've totally lost track of. Teaching was all about equipping the saints, the believers, inside the family gathering, but preaching, the Greek word is kerusso, that was for proclaiming a message to unbelievers outside the assembly. The modern sermon often blurs this line, preaching the gospel to believers who have already heard it and accepted it. And that can kind of keep the saints in this passive state, treating them like outsiders who need convincing instead of family members who need to be equipped.
Okay, so let's try and bring all of this together. We've basically traced this dramatic evolution, or maybe you could call it a de-evolution, in the language, the purpose, and the practice over the last 2,000 years.
These 3 steps really sum up the whole transformation. The meaning of the word itself shifted from the people to a place. The purpose of getting together shifted from building each other up to just watching a religious service. And the role of the people shifted from an active, every-member ministry to a passive audience watching a few designated leaders perform. The ultimate result is a system that can really encourage passivity and a lack of deep personal understanding.
You know, if you take just one thing away from all this, let it be this picture. The original ecclesia was not a religious theater where people went to sit in their seats and observe a ritual. It was a family reunion, a potluck where everyone brought something to the table, and the whole reason for being there was to encourage, strengthen, and build each other up.
And so this leaves us with a final and pretty challenging question. If we truly embrace this principle of oikodomai, of mutual, every-member edification, as the #1 reason for getting together, what would have to change? What would our meetings even look like? And that, right there, is a question that's really worth thinking about.